The mystery that is Tartaria has lately become one of the biggest rabbit holes on the internet. Gushing forth are tales of lost empires, of vanished people, mud floods, star forts, children without a history riding the orphan trains, advanced free energy technology, and even the possibility that the timeline of history we all believe may in fact be a lie. Yes, if you enjoy intrigue, a greater tale of subterfuge and the efforts at a cover-up may simply not exist. Now, I also posted another video giving the basics of the Tartaria mystery, so for a great synopsis of the controversy, I welcome you to check it out. The title of this particular video is Grabled History of San Francisco, so perhaps a definition of grabbler would be in order. A grabbler, according to the Urban Dictionary, is an individual with the ability to grab, knock over, or steal anything that gets in their way and or appealing to said individual. Now, for those who may need a general overview, basically there seems to have been a vast empire called Tartaria, centered on the region of northern Asia, that may have been so successful that it spread out over most of the northern hemisphere. Most have never heard of Tartaria, but it quite possibly could have been the largest empire on Earth in history, and may have still been an active empire as late as 1775. That's correct, the year before the signing of our Declaration of Independence. Now, the empire, although vastly spread out, exhibited a great deal of conformity and consistency with regards to the architecture, which was simply magnificent, and the layout of its cities demonstrated very advanced surveying and design. The buildings were simply unbelievable, and even if you're not a student of architecture, the magnificence of the structures alone will amaze you. They seem to be structures that would be very difficult to build today, if not nearly impossible. So if this, well, a couple of quick images of some of this architecture to just go through, just absolutely amazing. Some of the ruins, grand structures, a lot of domes and classical Greco-Roman columns and that type thing, but just amazing, amazing architecture. Just some images of what are believed to be Tartarian Empire buildings. So, if this vast empire did in fact exist, what happened to it? Well, the leading theory seems to be a catastrophic mud flood that appears to be worldwide in scope, that either completely buried some of its buildings, partially buried others, or get this, that may still exist today. In fact, you yourself may have visited some of them. Now, spoiler alert, in this video, we won't dive too deep into all the mysteries of free energy, star forts, and how our official timeline may have had about 1,000 years added to it, but I assure you, it still should be of particular interest. We'll look to the very foundations of the mystery. If this empire existed, we would most certainly have archaeological evidence of these buried buildings and other supposed buildings that are claimed to still exist today. Buckle up. You may be in for a wild ride. We'll start our journey right here at home in the good old USA, San Francisco specifically. Now, why not go to another older civilization, Trevor? Well, great question. You're obviously paying attention. Well, Europe and Asia are certainly older, but they also had existing civilizations before Tartaria. So it could be argued that the buildings we see from those previous kingdoms. Not so for the Americas, unless you conclude that the Native Americans had this building technology, but also just decided to live in teepees. No, America, the New World, was supposedly unexplored and unsettled. So if we find evidence of these advanced civilizations, we must conclude we have not been given the whole story. The second reason we go to San Francisco is because shortly after its beginnings, we see the first practical use of a technology called photography around 1850. Why West Coast? Well, for the settlements on the East Coast in the late 1600s and 1700s, we had no such luxury of examining photographs. For proof of what those areas looked like, we'd have to rely on books, paintings, or other written accounts. But I want you to see for yourself. For as they say, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Now, let's first use our common sense. When the group of settlers arrived on the east coast of the U.S. and found a vast, unexplored and unsettled land, they would be forced to basically start from scratch, building their own shelters, residences, and slowly, as others arrived and settled, developed cities. Now, for San Francisco, the situation was a bit different because of the Great Gold Rush. Very large numbers of people, half by wagon, half by sea, supposedly settled there overnight. So we can assume the city would grow more rapidly than a typical settlement, let's say in Wyoming, for example, but nonetheless, it still would have taken a considerable amount of time. So imagine yourself arriving in San Francisco, lured by the dreams of striking it rich during the Great Gold Rush. Now, just as a brief intro, in 1846, the USA annexed California, and in 1850 became the 31st state. The little settlement of Yerba Buena was renamed San Francisco, of course after the bay, on January 30th, 1847. At that time, San Francisco only had a population of about 800. However, in 1848, a man named James Marshall supposedly discovered gold. News of the find reached New York in December 1848, and as a result, people went to San Francisco by the thousands and the population boomed. Just a year later, in 1849, the population of San Francisco reached 25,000. Now, already we're seeing a problem with this story. Marshall didn't discover gold in San Francisco, but rather in the city of Coloma in El Dorado County, approximately 100 miles away. This is the outline of the county, and the red shape is the city of Coloma. Over here, again, we see the county outlined, and here's where San Francisco would be, so that's approximately 100 miles away. So would people immediately begin to build their homes in San Francisco and commute 100 miles a day to go pan for gold? Now, with automobiles and interstates, that's possible today. It would have been impossible with horse-drawn wagons or pack mules back then. Now, one could say because San Francisco was such a strategic port with inlets into the state that it grew because of that advantage, and that would be true. But if you were a prospector, it would not have been the best possible area to settle in. In fact, as this map shows, the primary areas for gold prospecting were many miles from San Francisco. To the north, you had the Northern California goldfields, and more in the middle, you had the Sierra Nevada goldfields. Again, here is San Francisco. You can see this is probably 200 miles away, and this is 100 miles away from Coloma. So what then lured them to settle this port city so far from the richest gold areas? Was there another treasure to be found right there in San Francisco? Perhaps one that was above ground, or at least partially. Well, let's stay on track here, and we'll just go with the official story for now. So what would an area look like that was previously very sparsely inhabited, except by Indians, when they arrived? Now, let's just use our common sense. This would be a typical settlement. I think this is actually in Colorado, perhaps built along a wagon trail that would have led west. Had a few entrepreneurs that may have said, hey, let's open up a shop here. We've got some farmers who have settled here and need to come to town for supplies, and others traveling through that may need food, water, or other provisions, and then a few other entrepreneurs join them, and then you'd end up with a little city. Or it would kind of be a little ghost town looking city today. But even for this little city, it probably didn't pop up overnight. There were one or two that started, and maybe a year or two later, a few others. This may represent 3 to 5 years, perhaps more. Another typical site that you would expect to see would be very primitive buildings, these log cabin type structures, these wooden sidewalks to stay above the mud when rains came through. Here's a little bit more developed city. You see a meat market here, a little more permanent structures. A lot of people with mules, a few horses there. Here we see a general merchandise store. That would kind of be like the Walmart of the day. But anyway, just get the idea of how long do you think it would take for all these businesses to pop up. And I'll kind of leave you to guess there, but this could easily be 10 years or more. Here's another very interesting photo. I think this is Colorado as well. You see buildings starting to pop up on both sides of the street. We'll zoom in just a little bit here, and we see this mogul house where you could get a meal for 25 cents. A few gentlemen there. Looks like a lady talking to the shop owner here of the bakery, perhaps asking him if he had any pumpernickel bread in, and he sadly informs her that all they had was sourdough. He may have said, well, that'll just have to do. It's interesting photos. Bear with me. I find them very interesting. But again, if you just look, the dirt roads and these are not new buildings. This town goes for some distance back there. I would be very hesitant to date this less than 10-year-old city, and perhaps more. Perhaps quite more for that to have been settled. Same thing here, a little bit more developed area, still dirt roads, a lot of these wooden structures, a little more permanent in nature, but how long do you think this one would have taken to settle? Another quite interesting picture, another little settled city here, somewhere out in the west. Take a little closer view here. It's kind of interesting, some of the people in here. You got a mom, looks like she's brought her 3 girls into town. They're all in their Sunday go meeting dress, and they're in front of a confectionery. So a town that's established enough to have a candy store. A shoemaker is the proprietor there with some of his work in his hand. And what do we have here in the middle? Uh-oh, this looks like could be trouble. Some young boys there, no telling what they're up to. And they're out in front of the Palace Steam Laundry. So how long before a town has its own steam laundry? Lumber yard back there. And again, just to zoom back out, how old would you think some of these buildings are, and how old would you think in general it takes to settle a little town? And this one's probably a little bit later. We see a train there, not sure if that'd be steam or coal fired. But again, we see the typical mode of transportation would be the wagons. You see some side streets developed, more permanent structures. Again, this town has been around for a little while. These didn't pop up overnight, but certainly you would expect it to its growth to have been attributed a lot to the fact that the railway came through and made it advantageous to start a little development there. This is one of the most interesting pictures of just Old West settlements, and I promise we will get back to San Francisco very shortly. But just to zoom in here, this busy streets, and you see a lot of construction going on, which is what you would expect to see for a new and growing city. Here's some here. Mostly all men in the streets coming in to work or do whatever they had to do. There are some ladies here. There are a couple of Native American women here. There's a couple of ladies here in their little house on the prairie outfits, perhaps heading out of town. An old covered wagon that looks like it was ox driven. And there's a little lawyer's office there. Now, this guy here is kind of interesting. He's in a nice carriage, and it is actually drawn by 6 horses. So this may have been for a longer trip that he was taking, maybe leaving town after a successful business trip. You got this guy who is driving the horses, and of course, who is this guy? Well, this rotund fellow is what they call riding shotgun. He might be the person you'd run into if you were a bandito and wanted to rob the stagecoach and find out what's in that strong box. Just really interesting pictures, and I promise we'll get back to our subject. But you also see tents back here in the background, and this may have been people who were just arriving, and what were they coming for? Well, they'd come over here to the U.S. Land Office to where they could stake their claim and then go build their futures. But to zoom out again, just take a look, and what would you guess this type of a city, although fast growing, much like San Francisco may have, would have taken to set all of this up? I'll let you guess about that, but I would certainly say that it was some great time involved with that. Now, let's go out of this file. I wanted to show you some others. Let me see if I can quickly get over there for you for San Francisco. And just make sure you're seeing what I'm seeing. Okay, you should be good. Okay, so this would be right before photography was widely used, and so we'll see a lot of these lithographs or paintings or drawings of what San Francisco supposedly looked like, at the time. Now, this one was done in supposedly depicts San Francisco, formerly Yerba Buena, in 1846, 1847. Now, we know it was done just a little bit after that because it lists on there before the discovery of gold. So this is a depiction of what San Francisco would have looked like in 1847, 1846. But it's not merely just an work of art. It's more of a points of interest or a chart of what some of the locations in San Francisco are. We see them numbered throughout the lithograph, and we see the ships lettered. And so this was supposed to give you an accurate representation of what San Francisco was in 1846. The very next lithograph, supposedly dated 1846, the same year as the last, we have a developed city here. I will zoom in just a little bit. I have so many, and I'm going to try to keep this video as short as I possibly can, but there's just so much information. Look at the city. Now, these are designed streets. These are well-developed areas. I mean, these buildings, some of them are just absolutely magnificent. Out here, I think that's Yerba Buena Island. You see families going maybe possibly picking berries. This guy's going to do a little work. He's got his plow. Young lady watering some vegetation out there, perhaps picking some things where they have planted. Quite an idyllic little life. Slice of Americana. And just for the wider panoramic view, this is supposed to be this same area or that same time period. So again, we're already seeing some discrepancies even with the lithographs that they can say whatever they want to say. This is another one, 1846, same year. So much less sparsely or more sparsely inhabited. This is Captain Montgomery. He's arrived on his ship. He's got the soldiers coming in, and they are seizing San Francisco for the United States. They're raising the flag. This is a view of Yerba Buena, which of course later becomes San Francisco in 1846. He's raising the American flag and seizing the region for the United States. Again, just a different depiction of supposedly that same time period. Now this quite very well may be the smoking gun of this whole video. If you look at this street map of the city of San Francisco in 1849, 1850, you see a very well-developed city. This took architects quite some time just to design. And then, of course, it would have taken a much, much longer to implement this plan, to actually build out the infrastructure of these city streets, which seem to be named, possible sewers, bridges, or anything else. But this is not something that prospectors and cowboys would have done when they first arrived in San Francisco. They would have not said to themselves, let's go ahead and design this place for it to facilitate, a million or more in a large city type situation. But also very interesting on this picture, if we can see the wharfs also, those don't pop up overnight. San Francisco in 1849-1850, the graded shaded indicates the relative density of occupation in the business and leading resident sections. So the darker the shade, the more population. You would expect that around the Bay Area, the Marina area, very dark, and then we see a little bit lighter but still dark areas moving out into the residential area. And then if we zoom out, you see much of the area that is not shaded at all. Was it inhabited at all? Again, this is 1849. This is supposedly the year the gold rush began. Our first photo. This would be what you would really see if you were there. This is 1849, and these are the abandoned ships of San Francisco. Yes, these are the abandoned ships of San Francisco. These ships were supposedly abandoned. The official story goes that these people seeking gold in their hills just ran in with their ships, jumped off, and I guess just headed for the hills and left and abandoned the ships altogether. This is a widely documented phenomenon. If you want to look it up for yourself, here are some other pictures of these supposedly abandoned ships. Looks like they've been there for quite some time, but perhaps not. We want to believe the story we're given. Some more. The ship is listed over, looks like. Also looks like a couple of buildings here. You zoom in just a little bit, that may have been covered by a washout there. Not sure what was going on there, but again, these are actual images, some of the first that you'll find of San Francisco. And we go back to lithographs. This is 1849. So what are they telling us it should look like? Well, in 1849, this is what they show. And again, quite sparsely inhabited. A little bit of maritime traffic coming in, some settlement along the hills. But if we go back, it looks nothing like this area, which if we zoom in behind these abandoned ships, you will see developed areas. This does not seem to be a city that was being established in that very year, to say the least. Here's another picture of the grid and layout of the city, just with a wide view. You can see this was done with some planning. This is 1849. This is again the year they showed up and they're going to plan the city this way. It doesn't seem to make sense. Doesn't seem to be reasonable to me. However, you can come up with your own conclusions. These city streets are laid out, they're named, individual parcels are marked. Very interesting. You can see the shoreline here that continues down and then out back into the bay. And then what do we see here? We see a man-made shoreline. We see streets that are supposedly built out in the bay. Well, no, this would have been area of former water that was filled in with dirt or sediment or perhaps mud. Wonder where they could have gotten mud from, but they could have used the mud to build out this area. And now you see other smaller parcels of land would have been built in this marina district. It looks like maybe a representation of one big wharf there. But even more interesting is down here, you got some color-coded things here. This first yellow one is a grant to Senora Briones. Let's see what was granted to Senora Briones. About a block and a half of prime San Francisco city developed. Now, why was it just granted to her? It's like given to her. Was it not someone else's before? Also here in the green area would be the claim of the heirs of Colonel King. So let's go see what they claimed. That would be this green area. He's got about 2/3 of a city block and a few parcels there. And again, if we look at the dating of this is the official map of San Francisco compiled from the field notes of the official resurvey. So we got a resurvey indicating that this was surveyed before. And again, this is 1849, the year of the gold rush. I don't know, just take a look at that and you could determine whether or not you think this is a city that started that year or not. Here we go back to our lithographs, and we're going to see a little bit. Make sure you guys are seeing all this. Okay, perfect. A little bit different story than the pictures are showing us. Here we got just a few rough built buildings and got some goats wandering a little bit out of town. And this is, of course, San Francisco, California, and some more primitive structures and a few that are getting a little bit more well-developed and more permanent structures there. But again, this is 1850. This would just been 1 year. So the lithographs are having to show us a little bit more of what the city may have looked like, but are they really giving us the full picture? Here's another from 1850, just a quick zoom in there. Yeah, some development, but again, still fairly primitive. But what's interesting about, and I think this is Alcatraz, or possibly Yerba Buena Island back there for reference. But what's interesting about this one, 1850, San Francisco, is this. So they include the advanced, well-planned grid of the city that would have taken so long to build out that, just the infrastructure, not to mention the buildings, even if it was just streets and roads and sewer systems or whatever, but they actually include it on this lithograph, which doesn't seem to be this city, although it's depicting the same. Interesting. Another one here, we see San Francisco, and this one's got a forest basically growing around it, and very country idyllic lifestyle. We've got some homes built up on the hills, some more in the valley around the Marina District, but certainly not what we're seeing with this grid. Now, here is one of the very first images of a panorama of a portion of the city. This is dated to around 1850, again, a year after the Great Gold Rush. This is what they've got built up. Now, not only is that impossible to have built all that up, I mean, if you want to look at the age of these buildings, is certainly a year older, one would guess. Here's another picture of the same exact photo. It's a little more defined, and again, look at the structures. They're built, nearly on top of each other. This doesn't happen when somebody moves into town. They wouldn't want to be right by their neighbor. This is a well-developed city that has taken some time to grow to this, level of inhabitation, and you can guess how long, but I mean, my goodness, somebody could say 50, 100 years or more. This is once again what the lithographs are telling us that the city looked like in 1850. This is the post office, and they are rather interesting to look at. We got a couple of young guys here, looks like engaging in some fisticuffs, but people are coming to pick up their packages and get newspapers to see what else is going on around the world. That's a lithograph. Now, this is interesting. This lithograph is depicting not the Great Fire of 1906, but there was a series of fires from 1849 to 1851. I'll just quote a little bit of something that I pulled up on this particular time. Now, it is claimed that between 1849 and 1851, San Francisco was almost entirely destroyed by fires 7 times between 1849 and 1851. The 5th fire, which was called the penultimate fire of 1851, destroyed 3/4 of the city and began with what was likely arson in the Portsmouth Plaza. Now, despite the horrific property damage and lives lost, workers were able to fully rebuild 1/5 of the city in just 10 days. Unfortunately, this was right in the time for the last of the Great Gold Rush fires, which razed the city again in June of that year. So wow, those cowboys and tin panners sure knew how to build. Not to mention, they supposedly did all this while at the same time fighting off a couple of outbreaks of the bubonic plague that killed hundreds. A depiction of that fire. We're going to go through some of these. Again, that advanced city grid that's just not happening in 1849. This one's from 1852. This is supposedly from 1850. The view of the procession when California was admitted to the United States. We see thousands of people around. We see advanced, somewhat aged-looking architecture. So not really matching up with the story line that we've all been told. Here's a very interesting character. His name is George Robinson Fardin. Now, Mr. Fardin was tasked with putting together a picture album of San Francisco, which he did, called the San Francisco Album, which was photographs of the many beautiful views and public buildings of San Francisco. Now, all of these pictures that I'm about to show you are taken between 1854 and 1856. So for reference, everybody floods in 1849 for the Great Gold Rush. This would have been 5, 6, 7 years later. Here's what we see. Now, just a quick zoom in here. We see older streets, we see older buildings, we see a developed city. Again, this is not 5 or 7 years after a great gold rush. This could be many years. I'll let you speculate there. Here's some of the other buildings that are taken pictures of. Just magnificent architecture, wonderful designs. I guess all this was supposedly built in just a few years with a cart and horse, hauling in the bricks or mortar or whatever they would need to construct such a magnificent structure. Very interesting. Here's a building that portions of it look a little newer, but then you see busted out windows here, indications of age along the columns. Little wagons and stages here. This almost looks like it may have even been a taxi area, transportation venue. We do a little bit of zooming in over here. These buildings across the street, you got roofs that are falling in. You've got obvious signs of age. This is again in the time frame of 1854 to 1856, which just doesn't seem to add up on any inspection, much less a close one. Here's a huge, massive building in that same time period taken by Mr. Fardin. This might be considered a mud flood building. You see windows that are half buried to the street level. Much larger top floor. These windows here seem to match these. So would that mean these type windows are what's underground? Not sure. But you know, you see these columns and they've got kind of ornate foundations. These columns just seem to go straight into the ground and just cut off. But still, this is a picture of a building that supposedly was there 5 or 6 years after the Great Gold Rush. Here's a panoramic view of the side of one of the hills in San Francisco. I won't zoom in, but you can tell many, many structures. This is a developed city. You can see definite signs of age. Interesting building here. This is a firehouse. Why you would need such a nice firehouse. And of course, you got a little dome, some Greco-Roman columns, and an antenna going up there. Some signs of Antiquitech. Very nice structure, but you can tell there's some age here. But just to pull back, a quick question. Which one of these buildings, 1, 2, 3, or 4, was built first? Most obviously, it was building number 3, and these were probably added alongside of it. So let's just inspect some of these buildings. These are older buildings. This one, kind of the roof line is sagging on one part. The door's either missing or is open, as this one is. And just signs of age on all of these buildings. Again, the time frame we're looking at is 5 to 7 years after the first settlers came to San Francisco. Another image, look at this building down here, obvious signs of age. This one here, obviously older as well. Larger structures, developed city. My goodness, if you look at this building here, it's obviously old, but the craftsmanship on this is absolutely wonderful, as all these are on this street level. Big piles of dirt and rubble in the street. Not sure what's going on there, but this certainly does not look like a building that was built just 5 or 6 years earlier. In fact, a lot of these buildings, when they were inherited, were basically given new names by the owners. You can see this one was taken over by Wells Fargo. May have originally been the Atlantic European Express. This may have been a travel agency that would get you to other countries. And over here we see an importer. So I'm not sure how we are to believe that there were established import-export businesses just 5 to 7 years after the first people came in the gold rush, but perhaps there were. Just another panoramic view of a well-established and well-aged city. And then back to another lithograph. So this is 1856, and let's see what it should be. This is what they're putting out to everybody. And we are seeing some more advanced, city structure going on here in terms of the roads and more buildings, but still very, likened to wilderness out here and these older wooden-looking structures. So they've got to kind of keep up with what's going on, and they somewhat do with their lithographs. But again, if you take a look, is this really what we were seeing with that last slew of pictures from 1854 to 1856? Again, for reference, this would be Alcatraz Island and Yerba Buena. Might be Market Street, possibly. A little more developed area here. They're having to show us with the lithographs, because this is 1862 now. But it doesn't quite seem to match up with the actual photos that we're seeing. Now, this one's 1870. Perhaps another area of the city. No, there's Yerba Buena. So for reference, we're kind of in that same area. But here we're seeing much older, just kind of shoddily constructed wooden structures. You're seeing guys coming in from the wilderness with their pack mules, and we see some maritime traffic out there. We see some city being developed. But again, this is 1870. Much different from the structures that we're seeing actual pictures from Mr. Farden was able to provide for us. Wow, 1870. Look at the magnificence of this hotel. Again, we see the Antiquitech all over, little spires, little antennas that are popped up, steel structures up there. You don't need 20 lightning rods. What were they actually used for? I am not sure. Just an interesting picture as well. You see some gentlemen down here in the top hats. And this guy walking along the edge of the street. Poor fella's got a crutch and he's missing his right leg, and he's still packing something. So he's probably a tough guy to do all that. But again, look at the architecture everywhere. And this is 1870. This would have been roughly, was that 20 years after Gold Rush? Another interesting picture here. This is 1870 as well. This is called the Second Street Cut. It just looks like an area that's just been washed out to the bay or dug out. I'm not sure exactly how that would have occurred. Would have taken a lot of digging, but it's certainly something that occurred after these homes were built. I wouldn't expect these people to build these nice homes right on the edge of a mudslide. One interesting thing to talk about photography is, when I first saw this kind of looked like a fissure, and this might be smoke coming out of there. I'm like, what in the world's going on there? But on closer inspection, this relates to the time of the technology of the photography. the apertures would have to remain open a little bit longer to get the image onto the glass or plate or whatever technology they were using. And so if a group of people were moving during that time period, you'd kind of get these ghost images. And I think this is exactly what we're seeing. You're seeing a kind of clear outline of a couple of people. Maybe they stood still for a couple of seconds and then moved on, but they would have started the picture when they were here and gotten up to this point by the time the photo was completely taken. Now that may have taken 10 or 15 seconds, but you can clearly see the images there. They start here, they're here. That's a clear image of the individual, that is as well. But you also see still images. So this would be people that were standing still for the whole 10 or 15 seconds, as were the couple of horses there and these wagons as well. Just very, very interesting. Another example of the grand architecture, just absolutely amazing. The Antiquitech on top. Again, we're seeing the little antennas up, steel structures, but magnificent. And this may be another example of a mud flood building. You see the street level here is probably at the roof or the top of the first floor level, and this wall and stairs looks like it may actually be older than this. I mean, newer than the structure. It looks a little newer to me, and structure looks a little bit older. Now we're getting to probably the later 1870s. You see the trolley cars, but they're still horse-drawn. We do see the electricity being run in now by the power poles. But again, if you just look at the architecture, just absolutely amazing that in 20 years or so, this is the type of a city that was built up. And do these look like new buildings? Or do they look like they have been there for quite some time? I'll leave that up to you to speculate on. Just another lithograph graphic chart map of San Francisco. Now we are seeing more of the city and street layouts with some of their lithographs, much different than the very earliest ones. This is probably one of the most interesting photos I've ever seen in my life, not only because of the Tartaria story and that type of thing, but just how large and how much you can zoom into this thing. But this is San Francisco, so we'll zoom in a little bit more, and you see the top of this, also this Antiquitech. You'll notice a lot of seemingly abandoned or very sparsely populated. You see very few people in these pictures. Now, it could have been some of the shutter speed, and you only get them if they are standing still. But as I showed earlier, if they were moving, you would see those ghosted images, and we don't. In fact, someone supposedly has counted all the people that they could make out on this whole entire picture from zooming in and spending a lot of time, and they've said that it's approximately 80 to 100 people here, another 80 to 100 wagons. But just amazing architecture that we're seeing here. And this is supposedly 1878. This is the work. It's very famous. You can see it all over the internet, by Edward Muybridge in 1878, called the Panorama of San Francisco. Look at these two mansions, just absolutely amazing. Now, we do see newer landscaping that's done around these houses, and these people are obviously wealthy. But something else that caught my eye was this structure. It looks like it's built on the back of this one, but if you zoom in a little bit, you can actually tell that it's part of this guy's property. You can see his property line runs here and along the bottom of that house and out here to the front. So this is actually on his property. I'm like, what in the world is that? And then I noticed the chimneys and pipes coming up out of the top. I said, that's a building inside of there. And later on, I found out this was the Crocker house. And he was obviously a wealthy individual. And I don't think he wanted this existing structure on his block when he was redoing it all. And he built a wall around it to spite the person. And I saw in another picture, it's actually called the Crocker Spite Wall. You can see the lumber that's used to prop up that wall to make sure it doesn't blow over. But this rich guy didn't want to look at his house, and he probably wouldn't sell it out to him. so they could just knock it down. He said, no, I'm staying here. And so he said, okay, I'll just build a wall around your house. Very interesting. If we just take a panorama, just a sweeping view, again, this would be Alcatraz for reference. And on over here, we find Yerba Buena. But you can spend a lot of time just exploring this picture. But some of the architecture of this church here is just absolutely amazing. Again, very sparsely inhabited streets. Again, signs of age with these buildings that are unmistakable. Just magnificent structures that existed here without a doubt. Look, I think this is a synagogue. There, another huge tower church there, another church there. Magnificent church there, but just to spread back out, this is the panorama view in 1878 of San Francisco, and this just does not seem like a city that had been around for, let's say, 30 years. This looks like a city that could have been around for 100 years or more. Perhaps a lot more. This is one of the buildings. This is the Hotel Baldwin. Magnificent, amazing structure. Again, the spires, the antennas, the Antiquitech, the amazing architecture. This is 1879. Horse-drawn buggies. We do see power lines coming in instead of perhaps using some of this Antiquitech with free energy. They figured out how they could put it along a wire, tell whose house it was going to, and charging them for it. Who knows? But just an amazing structure. I'm going to study that. Some of the architecture. Here's another one. This fantastic architecture once again. Dome spires, Antiquitech. Intricate brickwork, just absolutely amazing. And this would potentially be another example of a mudflood building. You can see the street level goes to about midway of that particular floor. It's theorized that if they were found this way, you just build stairs to the second floor and that becomes your entryway. Now, very interesting. This is next great earthquake and fire that ravaged San Francisco in 1906. Supposedly 8.2 magnitude earthquake. And then after all the shaking, the gas lines busted, fire broke out everywhere. So just to read a little bit, and I'm sorry I don't have the source to quote from, but on April 18th, 1906, one of the worst natural disasters in the history of the United States shook San Francisco. Though the quake was bad, 80% of the city was destroyed by the fires that raged for days after the last aftershock was felt. Although the Great Fire in 1849, which we looked at earlier, was stopped when people dynamited buildings, the same tactic backfired in 1906. Dynamited buildings caught fire too, spreading the conflagration rather than quenching it. It's estimated that about 3,000 people died, but this wasn't entirely due to the blaze. Some were shot by soldiers brought in to protect the wrecked city from looters in the weeks that followed. Over the next decade, the city was rebuilt in ways that vastly improved on its original haphazard design. Now, do you remember the grids and maps of the city? I don't know that I would describe that as haphazard. I would maybe describe that as quite advanced. But they were going to rebuild it here from 1906 to 1915. So in a period of 9 years, they were going to put 80% of this city back together. Designers widened the streets, added thoroughfares that allow people to get quickly from one end of the city to the other. Beautified City Hall. Remember that. Beautified City Hall, indicating their city hall may have not been so beautiful before. And built a subway under Market Street. Most of the major construction was completed by 1915. We got 80% of the city destroyed in 1906, and then 9 years later, it's all fixed back. In that year, San Francisco hosted the Panama-Pacific Exposition, which we will get to very quickly. That year's World's Fair, which was held in what became the Marina District at the newly constructed Palace of Fine Arts. Somehow, a more beautiful San Francisco rose out of the fires and tents once again. We're going to see a few other pictures of the destruction here, the fires and earthquake in 1906. Again, grand structures, just absolutely amazing. People walking here in the rubble and the remains. You can see a wider view here of the destruction. Very interesting picture here. Very highly pixelated, so we can get some good definition. Now, some of the structures remain, but you can see some areas were just completely wiped out. These city blocks, there's nothing left. It's almost like something just vaporized these things, or these fires just literally burnt them to the ground, and the brick and everything was, relegated to dust. Like this whole area was just wiped off, but the city streets remained, and you see that all throughout there. Now, I know we're talking about a lot of theories and speculation about what San Francisco really was, but let me show you this image. Now, I'm going to flip back from the first one I showed you to the second, and if you look up towards the left top side, you see an image that just kind of pops up. And I'm just saying this to be careful about what some people will tell you. If you look up there, it's actually kind of depicting a kind of a steampunk airship, a dirigible, I guess filled with helium, and it's got some sails up there, and it's got a boat bottom, and kind of even a propeller there, but that was obviously added in right over there. Here's the previous image. We don't see it, and then the next image we do. Nonetheless interesting. More images of this fire. You can just see whole swaths of land, buildings that are just gone. A very interesting picture here of the fires. You see this whole front of this building is collapsed out from the earthquake, and the large part of San Francisco just on fire, and the smoke billowing up, and people everywhere just out in the streets watching it burn. These ladies just can't believe what a great fire they're witnessing, and the guys over here has pulled up chairs to watch it, and they're kind of like, we found the place 50 years ago, easy come, easy go, maybe we can find another one. I mentioned they wanted to beautify City Hall. This is the old City Hall, so yeah, this one needs beautifying. This is just a ramshackle shack here, if you will. This next picture shows the same image, just a little kind of an artist rendering, but it's very, very close, and you see a little bit more detail and just how absolutely wonderful this structure was. And another view from this angle over here that I'll show you where that dome is. You're looking at the dome and the City Hall building in the back. So what happened to it? Well, destroyed by earthquake and the fires. Here's the picture of it after its destruction, but luckily they needed a little bit more beautified City Hall. And so this is what they came up with. Amazing. Now this was completed, I think, in 1915, started like in 1913. So in 2 years they slapped this thing up, and we know it's true because we got the scaffolds right there. Now, never mind, the whole building looks already constructed, and there's just some scaffolding and a couple of cranes there, but this proves that it was built in 2 years flat. What another amazing structure. I'm glad they got out of that last one that was just kind of a dump, but this one's very, very nice. Look at the end. This is a modern day picture of it. Absolutely magnificent. I mean, the Greco-Roman columns, the destruction of this building, the dome, everything. Look at the inside. This is, I don't know how to even describe how nice this is. Get the floor, the granite steps, and zoom back out and just get a good look at the whole thing. So this is the City Hall that San Francisco enjoys today. Now this gets us up to 1915, and our last subject we'll cover is the Panama-Pacific International Exposition. And this was one of dozens and dozens of World's Fairs that were held from the late throughout the late 1700s into the 1800s, even into the early 1900s, that are very odd. But theirs was called the Panama-Pacific International Exposition. This is a panoramic view. You'll see just absolutely amazing structures. This is the Palace of Horticulture. Here in the middle, the centerpiece is the Tower of Jewels. We'll see pictured more in, what was this one? Festival Hall, I think. So the story with these things are that these grand structures were built, sometimes 200 or more buildings over sometimes hundreds of more acres, all temporary. Or most all temporary. There are some of these buildings that survive to today that were built permanently, supposedly, but all the rest were temporary, made out of staff. This was a material that was comprised of a combination of plaster and burlap. You just slap these things up because they're only meant to last a year. When the World's Fair is over, they tear them all down or they get burned up. But dozens of these types of fairs all over, and you just wonder, where in the world is this type of architecture coming from? Here's some pictures of the Expo. Again, that would be the Tower of Jewels, the Palace of Horticulture, and Festival Hall there. Just all these dome structures, just amazing, amazing architecture just to have been built temporarily. That would be Alcatraz Island in the background. The Palace of Fine Arts. And all these Greco-Roman columns back here. This classical architecture. This building looks older than a year or two that they claim it took them to build all of this. This is, and I'll zoom in a little bit here. This is called the Court of Palms. See the palm trees around, and this entrance over here was the Palace of Education, and then across the court was the entrance to the Palace of Liberal Arts. And just absolutely amazing temporary structures. The Fountain of Energy. What a grand fountain. And sculptures here and just amazing, amazing artwork. Again, with the rest of the expo behind it. That's the Fountain of Energy. Here's a better look at Festival Hall. Absolutely grand building. This building would be just torn down, supposedly afterwards, because it's temporary. Yep, we don't have to do too much with it because it's temporary. We'll just throw a little something up there and nothing special. Then tear it all down in a year later. In the Tower of Jewels there. Just some of the pictures of the. Now we know the story is correct, because if we had pictures of the area before these buildings were constructed, temporarily, of course, and here's what is claimed to be one. So you can see the outline here. I guess this would be the architect is saying, well, we're going to put the Tower of Jewels here, and we'll do Festival Hall over here. And of course, these buildings don't exist in this picture, so we know they had to be all built, correct? And here's the outline for that dome of the Palace of Horticulture, and another tower and another dome over here. So we know the story has to be correct, right? Yeah, see, here's an actual photo that, where the Palace of Horticulture isn't quite constructed yet. And look, there is no Tower of Jewels. They had to build it. So their story seems to be lining up pretty well. I guess we should believe it. And here's a picture 6 months before opening. You can see they've gotten a whole lot farther with their construction. The palace is up. That palace is up, and it's only temporary. Well, we're still waiting on the Festival Hall to get finished and the Tower of Jewels, but I'm sure they'll come along rather quickly. We see, oh, yep, there were 3 months before the Expo. Now you've got, Tower of Jewels pretty much up. Still got to do some finishing touches there and that type of thing. And then, here's some interesting gentlemen. These guys are the National Association of National Park Superintendents, or the Panama-Pacific International Exposition. So these grabblers are the guys who know exactly what went on this time. This older guy right here, I'm sure he knows the story. I'm sure they probably all do. Here's another older gentleman. He probably knows very well what this area looked like before and after, and whether if we know what we've been told is correct or not. Now, this is a picture of the Palace of Fine Arts that we saw earlier in such grand shape. Now it's under a little disrepair. It looks like the weeds have grown up, and look at all this grown in between the columns. I mean, now this is 1919, so this would have been about 4 years after the Expo. And looks like sediment is washed in. I mean, the place is in ruins in just 4 years. I'm not sure those superintendents were doing such a good job of maintaining their park afterwards. Or could this quite possibly have been a picture of what they found before the Expo? And instead of those pictures being what we saw a few months after the Expo, as these pictures are claimed to be the construction of it, what if this is the actual deconstruction? So this would be not 3 months before the completion, but 3 months after, and they're starting to tear these buildings down. This would have been about 6 months after, more parts of it tore down. This would have been about a year after, with most of the structures gone. And then, of course, you would understand how these outlines are so finely done. This isn't how buildings are laid out on blueprints. This looks like somebody had the existing buildings and did an outline of them, and then after they tore them all down, put the outlines in and told you this was the future plans. I don't know. I'll leave that for you to decide. But anyway, wouldn't it be interesting if you were the person who just happened to woke up on this, let's say 10 years before the gold rush or exposition, and said, wow, look at this. Look what we found. And I'll tell you what would be a good idea if we just cleaned it up. You know, cleaned up the shrubbery around it, trimmed the shrubs, so to speak. We got a little girl here we can put in the picture to make look very idyllic. And we can throw a few ducks or swans out there, clean up this thing. We could have us a big World's Fair and make a postcard out of it. Again, this is a picture of after supposedly 1919, you know, a few years after the World's Fair. And look what a state of disrepair the Palace of Fine Arts is in. We've got weeds growing on top of the thing all throughout it. And then they were able to, that was all happening just 4 years after this. Or did they just clean this mess up into this? I don't know. Very interesting. So, Does the fact that it seems San Francisco was indeed inhabited before 1846 mean that all the stories of Tartaria are true? Perhaps not. It doesn't necessarily mean whoever inhabited San Francisco before was at all part of the Tartarian Empire. I concede as much. However, San Francisco is not the only example of unexplained civilizations that existed. These same storylines and circumstances can be found all over the world. It's not a one-off by any means. Just in the U.S., research Chicago, Buffalo, Seattle, New Orleans, Detroit, Philadelphia, St. Paul, Cincinnati, Houston, Baltimore, and countless other areas. There just seems to be city after city that was abandoned. Another similarity is the consistent finding of buildings that seem to be partially buried. In city after city, we see this phenomenon as well. In some cities, we see whole buildings being found under the existing buildings at ground level when excavating is done. So does this prove there was a worldwide mud flood? Again, perhaps not. Yet another similarity are the World's Fairs held between roughly 1790s and the early 1900s. Do an internet search for World's Fairs. There are dozens and dozens. So many of which share the same story, just grand and majestic buildings and palaces covered hundreds of acres, mostly all meant to be temporarily made out of staff, a cheap plaster and burlap mixture. Most all open for only a year or less and then demolished or ending up engulfed in mysterious fires. Now, does that mean they were all Tartarian buildings they wanted to cover up and destroy? Perhaps not. I mean, some would say yes, absolutely, and others would say no, no way. But I bet I can ask you all a question that everyone would agree is true. Do people lie? Yes. And do governments lie? Big yes. Now, I may not be completely convinced that instead of settling these cities, we simply inherited them. But I found enough discrepancies to wonder if the real rush to San Francisco wasn't solely for the gold in them there hills, and just possibly it may have been for a claim to an empty mansion. It makes me wonder who those first people were who may have stumbled across these cities and decided how to divvy it all up, like finding a pot of gold. Were they our true founding fathers, as in found? It's up to you to decide how far you want to dig to find the truth. There are some that say there just isn't enough proof, and there's some that, people who quite frankly wouldn't want to know. They're as content as can be living in the paradigm created for them, true or not. As the saying goes, ignorance is bliss, or at least it can be sometimes. Thanks again for tuning in to Quest Logos. I'm J. Trevor Adkins. Take care, and God bless.